Let's look at a document from the fall of 2001, when Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz created this memo for his boss, Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense. This was just 10 weeks after the attacks that changed the course of history, but this document wasn't about that. It was about Iraq, a country that had nothing to do with 9/11. Rumsfeld reviewed the document before meeting with an army general. He marked it up with his notes, giving us insight into what the Secretary of Defense of the United States was really thinking about after 9/11. How this group of military leaders were set on, quote, building momentum to topple Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein, to decapitate the government, a government that was no longer useful to them. Saddam Hussein had been a useful client to the United States, especially in the 80s when he was waging a war against Iran, an enemy of the United States. But those days were now over. Saddam had turned into just a troublemaker in the region, creating instability that could threaten the US's easy access to oil. And in many ways, Iraq was an old mess in need of cleaning up, a mess that Bush Sr. had failed to resolve during the first Gulf War. Iraq was supposed to disarm itself after that war, but had kicked out the UN weapons inspector teams. But that wasn't the main reason why right after 9/11 these guys were talking about invading Iraq. A bigger reason is that these leaders wanted to remind the world who the global superpower was. They needed to, after being brutally attacked on their own soil. A non-US friendly regime like Iraq couldn't be allowed to stand in a post-9/11 world. Or, in the words of Rumsfeld himself, hours after the towers fell, quote, we need to bomb something else to show that we're big and strong and not going to be pushed around. Iraq and its leader was that something else. And now Bush and his advisors were looking at a plan to make it a reality. But how to start the war? Could they tie Saddam Hussein to something that Americans feared, like 9/11 or anthrax? Or could they tell a story about weapons of mass destruction? What other countries could they bring in to support their invasion? And of course, the most important consideration, Rumsfeld jots it here at the end, they would need an influence campaign. They would need to sell the war. And when should they begin? How about right away?
Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror.
3 months later, the president was telling the world that Iraq was one of a group of evil countries that the US must oppose in the global fight against good and evil.
States like these constitute an axis of evil. The price of indifference would be catastrophic.
By the summer of 2002, this idea that Bush's advisors had scratched down after 9/11 was developing into an official policy. That handwritten influence campaign to sell the war was now in full swing.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction.
We know they have weapons of mass destruction. There isn't any debate about it.